I've sketched a simple outline for the sheep on cold press watercolour paper. And for a full list of all the materials I'm using, please see the description below. I'm mixing up colours for the background, starting off with a dilute ultramarine for the sky. Then I'm going to mix ultramarine with a pinch of Hansa Yellow Deep for the background trees. So it's going to be slightly creamier. I'm going to paint this damp into wet. So I'm going to wet the background with my size 10 brush carefully around the sheep. As long as you don't wet the sheep, the paint won't run onto the sheep. I'm being careful to not wet the pom-poms as well. I'm not wetting the foreground, it's just the background here. So spend time just wetting it, allowing the water to soak into the paper. I'm loading my brush with ultramarine. I've actually added a pinch of cerulean as well, just to make the sky a little bit brighter. Painting this wet into wet with my size 8 round brush. And I'm painting this just above the top of the heads of the sheep. I'm going to load the brush with the ultramarine with a pinch of the Hansa Yellow Deep. You can use cadmium yellow. I'm kind of starting off painting this wet into wet, just carefully around the sheep. Really load your brush and sort of paint right down to the horizon and right up to just below the blue sky. Because what will happen is the paint will run itself anyway. It will run up there naturally. It'll be attracted to that sort of wet paint above. So I'm leaving that gap so I don't lose my sky and allow that to kind of drift up naturally. So just carefully painting around the sheep, especially those pom-poms, using the tip of the brush on those tricky areas, and again sort of just painting here wet into wet, leaving the gap between the sky. And these are going to be background trees, so this is the sort of first layer. So I'm always loading my brush and painting carefully around the sheep using the tip of the brush. And if you keep loading your brush, your painting doesn't dry out as quickly because you're keeping everything super wet. So just sort of painting in the corners there, loading the brush again and just carefully painting here down to the sort of bottom there. Going to paint across the legs. You don't have to worry about the legs. They're going to be darker than the background. So just sort of painting this pretty much almost wet and dry in places, but then pushing the paint back into the wet paint on the right hand side. I'm mixing up some phthalo blue. You can use Prussian blue with a little bit of burnt umber. You can use burnt sienna. So it's a slightly darker, creamier colour, and this is going to be for the background trees. I'm going to take the excess paint off on my paper towel. I'm going to paint damp into wet using the tip of the brush there to create the look of fir trees in the distance here. So they're quite a neutral colour because I want to give it sort of more of a wintry effect there. So just painting damp into damp here, or damp into wet rather, on the right hand side. And what happens when you paint damp into wet, the paint sort of blends a little, but it doesn't spread too far like when you paint wet into wet. So you get sort of soft edges of sort of distinct shapes like these trees. So I'm making them sort of pointy at the top to give them the impression of the fir trees there. Mixing up a little bit more of the phthalo blue and painting this darker sort of blue damp into damp there. And just adding a little bit of darks and details just at the bottom here, not where the legs are, because you want the light to be where the legs are, just in between the legs, a few little dark marks, damp into damp. So mixing up a little bit more of that phthalo blue and painting damp into damp, just to build up a little bit more dark. It has a pinch of burnt umber there. And it's just to add a little bit more detail to the background. Adding a little bit of detail around the pom-poms there, working damp into damp with my size 8 brush, just carefully bringing out those pom-poms. Mixing up here some more phthalo blue, this time with burnt sienna. You can see there's hardly any water, but I've taken the excess paint off on the paper towel. I'm just adding some grasses, and this is more in the middle distance. And I'm using the tip of the brush just to sort of bring those grasses forward to create depth in my painting. I'm also adding a little bit of phthalo green as well, just for this warmer colour to come forward in the painting. Mixing up a little bit of ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna. I'm painting wet on dry, a little bit of shadows in the snow with my size 8 brush, just here and there. Leave lots of white paper so it looks like a lovely blanket of snow. So just a few more little marks there with this blue-grey colour. And now I'm using the tip of the brush to paint some burnt sienna mixed with a little bit of the ultramarine, a dash of that phthalo green. And so just sort of paint grasses damp into damp on the blue, but then wet on dry just above there to create the look of little sort of grasses coming through the snow. Look really effective because it's quite dark. And I'm just adding a few little marks just here and there as well. Look at that, it just brings everything to life. Less is more, remember. So just adding a few more sort of lighter grasses just here and there. I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of table salt on the background, really sparingly, and that will soak up some of the sort of blue-green paint to create sort of light, sort of sparkly, wintry textures. And I'm going to allow the salt to dry naturally, and as you can see that it's worked beautifully. So I'm mixing up ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm painting with my size 6 round brush, wet on dry, the left-hand side of the face, the dark sort of side of the face. I want the light to be coming from the right. So I'm painting each face on the left-hand side and just painting the last face here of the sheep, wet on dry, about halfway. I've rinsed my brush, I've taken the excess water off, and I'm just blending the middle to the outside edge. So it just looks a little bit paler and it just makes the faces look more 3D. I didn't want to go into any more detail than that. So I'm going to paint the legs of the sheep next, wet on dry with my size 6 brush. It's literally like a long, thin triangle, so a little bit wider at the top and thinner at the bottom there. I'm actually going to paint some shadows underneath the feet so it grounds the sheep. So that will be coming next, so they won't look like they're floating. This is a very idealised painting. It's not supposed to be a representational painting of sheep. It's a Christmas card idea, so they're quite sort of cartoonish in a way as well. So I'm painting wet on dry just directly underneath the sheep there to create some shadow using the ultramarine and burnt sienna, and then using a clean damp brush just to smudge that sort of shadow colour just to make it look a little bit more natural. And I'm just sort of shaping the legs a little bit better as well there using the ultramarine and burnt sienna. So I'm going to allow the painting to dry once more. For this next stage, I'm going to paint the shadows on the sheep on the sort of underneath side. So I'm going to leave the top of the sheep quite light. So I've mixed up ultramarine, a pinch of pink and a pinch of burnt sienna. So it's to neutralise the violet. So you mix up a blue violet and add a pinch of burnt sienna or even yellow. I've painted that shadow wet on dry, and I'm using a clean dilute brush just to soften and blend. So the top half of the sheep is really light. Again, this is very idealised, but it's just to make them look a little bit 3D. So here I'm leaving a little white gap between the sheep on the left and the sheep in the middle. And I'm using my size 6 brush, painting this shadow colour just a little bit at the bottom, and then using a clean damp brush to work my way up so the shadow gets lighter as it goes towards the top of the sheep. Again, painting the sheep on the right hand side, I'm leaving a small gap on the left so that that paint doesn't bleed into that wet sheep in the middle, and using a clean damp brush to blend and soften that shadow colour. So I'm mixing up Pyrolle Red here. I'm painting this lightish wash, wet on dry with my size 6 brush. I will be adding a little bit of shadow as well. Not too much, but just enough to give it a little bit of detail. So I'm just carefully painting this wet on dry. Immediately adds colour and brings those sheep forward. So painting the middle sheep here. It doesn't have to be too sort of fancy, just sort of keep it simple, the shape here. It will all sort of kind of work, but remember, less is more. Don't overwork it. It is just a Christmas card idea. And you can do lots of these as well, hand paint them once you get on a roll. I know a lot of you do actually paint your Christmas cards early as well. And this, I hope you will find this inspiring, and I will put a list of my other Christmas card tutorials that I previously published in the years gone by if you need any more inspiration. I'm using a clean damp brush just to lift off some of the paint to create some lights here and there. So you can rinse your brush and take off the excess paint off in the paper towel and allow the brush to be like a sponge to lift off some of that paint. I'm just adding a little bit of shadow using the ultramarine, the pink and the burnt sienna mix, and painting wet on dry the pom-poms at the bottom there, leaving lots of white at the top using my size 6 brush. I've rinsed the brush and I'm just softening the hard edge there, leaving plenty of white still at the top of the pom-poms. I'm using that same colour, the ultramarine, with a pinch of pink, pinch of burnt sienna, diluted. I'm painting the left-hand side of the hats there, the white area, and I'm blending with a clean damp brush so that the light is on the right hand side, and adding just a little bit more dark there to the pom-poms at the bottom and on the left hand side, a little bit more dark to the light of the hats as well, damp into damp. And I'm getting a little bit more of that shadow colour and adding a little bit more dark directly under the feet there to really ground the sheep so they don't look like they're floating. I'm going to allow the painting to dry once more. What I'm doing now is I'm just adding a little bit of shadow colour. So I've added ultramarine to the red and I'm painting wet on dry. A little bit of shadow just here and there with my size 6 round brush. I'm going to allow the painting to dry thoroughly once more. And the reason why I say thoroughly is because I'm actually rubbing off the pencil line, so I don't want to smudge any paint. And it kind of really lightens up the sheep there because I obviously had a few sketchy pencil lines as well. I'm using Brusho SprinkleIT to give a little bit of sparkle to my painting, and I'm going to spritz the surface with the spritzer bottle just using water. You could use some glitter and add some PVA glue here and there and then add some glitter on top. Here I used a thoroughly dried brush and dipped it into the Brusho SprinkleIT, and I'm just tapping the brush, allowing the sprinklets to fall onto the damp paper, and it fixes it to the paper. And as you can see, it gives your background especially a lovely sparkle. And as you can see, I've removed the washi tape, so it's got a lovely light border. If you don't have this product or glitter, you could actually spatter white paint. So I've added a tiny bit of water to the white gouache and I am spattering the sheep and the background there with my size 8 brush to make them look like they're in a snowy sort of Christmassy storm. And I'm adding a little bit more white to the top of the pom-poms to really make them stand out. I'm going to allow the painting to dry once more. What I'm doing now is I'm going to use some glue just to attach it to a blank greeting card. So I'm going to glue the back of the painting. Make sure you sort of put this on a clean surface so you don't sort of get any smudges on your painting, and make sure it's thoroughly dry. Apply the glue and then stick that to your card and try to frame it within the card equally there before you press down. And then use a bit of paper towel to really press down the painting to the card there. And here is the finished Christmas card, sheep with Santa hats. I love the sort of background as well. It works really well with the sheep, and the red really pops. And I love the shimmer of Brusho SprinkleIT as well, as you can see in the light. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And if you like the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You'll get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials, outline sketches, ad-free content, more voiceover, and you can cancel anytime. Details about my membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.